Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this evening. There's a wonderful atmosphere in here. It feels great. And I'm so happy to be here. I've made a slight change of direction in my writing life, which is, I've written my first novel, and it involves altered states of consciousness, two characters, one 24,000 years ago, one today, entangled together in a battle of good against evil that journeys through time. And I was given the idea for this novel by an amazing, an extraordinary shamanistic brew, which has been used in the Amazon for thousands and thousands of years, called ayahuasca. It means the vine of souls. And one night in Brazil, ayahuasca gave me a story and said, write it. And I did. So the talk I'm going to give tonight doesn't relate specifically to Entangled, although many of the themes that I cover do come up in Entangled, and the non-fiction basis of it all is in the book, my book Supernatural. Therianthropes. This is from beastmen, from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. Of course, they're very common in popular culture today, but indeed have been part of popular culture for a very long time. Here from Japan, this serpent woman, and here a medieval fairy called Melusine, who we'll come to later. And you know, you have to begin to wonder, where do these ideas come from? We tend to think of them as kind of Hollywood creations today, but they actually go back much further than that. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and here from Acadia, a bull man, another of those therianthropes, fighting with a lion. Of course, ancient Egypt is full of these creatures called therianthropes. All the Egyptian gods, really, almost all of them, have a mixture of human and animal characteristics. And here, this beautiful image, she's actually looking at her own soul, what the ancient Egyptians called the Ba soul, where the soul takes wings and flies and goes on to the next life. But again, it's depicted as part bird and part human. Such imagery is very common in ancient Sumer as well, in what is now modern Iraq. But these ideas go back a whole lot further than that. They actually go back to the very first pieces of art that human beings ever created, as far as we know. Certainly the oldest surviving pieces of art. And these take us back into the depths of the last ice age, between 40 and 30,000 years ago. And this is actually the oldest surviving piece of fully representational art anywhere in the world. It's from Italy, and it does depict a therianthrope with the horns of a bull, but the body of a human being. This old piece, this is the oldest piece from Africa so far found, and again, the hind legs, although the four parts are feline, the hind legs are depicted in the way that the rock art of southern Africa always depicts human legs. This is an extraordinary piece from a cave in Germany, carved out of mammoth ivory, and it's about the height of my knee, it's a lion man from a cave in Germany more than 32,000 years ago. And here from Chauvet Cave in France, we see this bison man with the head of a bison and the hump of a bison, but then coming down here to the legs, which are human. And other figures like this occur again and again in the painted caves of southern Europe, combination of beast and human. This amazing creature they call the sorcerer. It's a combination of stag, wolf, owl, human being, and horse. And you really have to ask yourself, where did they get the idea from? What's the inspiration from? You know, we don't really know a lot about cave art. There have been theories, various theories about cave art. One of the ones that is most commonly regarded as the correct theory, but is not, is that it was some kind of hunting magic, that they were depicting the animal species that they wanted to hunt and kill. But this has absolutely been ruled out by the archaeology around the caves, where we find that the animals that are most commonly depicted in the caves were not eaten around the caves at all. And it has nothing to do with that. Furthermore, only about 2% of the animal species depicted in the cave art are actually pierced by projectiles. The other ones are not. And certainly a creature that is part bull and part bison and part human is not something that would be naturalistically observed in real life. But if we pull back a little bit further, we can begin to see something else going on in this image. This bison man is straddling a human female, the pubic triangle there and the legs. But weirdly, this female has no head. Instead, her right arm is transforming into the head of a lion. So this is a very strange idea that we're looking at here. This is bison man about to make love with a headless lion woman who's kind of caught in the process of transformation between a human and a lion. Certainly not a naturalistic observation. So we have a mystery here. What is going on? And here I'm going to be giving you examples. I could give you examples from cave and rock art anywhere in the world. I've seen very similar imagery in Utah, for example. It's one of the strange things. It doesn't matter where this art is or when it was painted, there are these incredible common themes. Now, this is from South Africa, and I'll be showing you mainly South African and European rock art. And here, perched on a kind of zigzag, we see these creatures which are actually antelopes or human beings transforming into antelopes. They're caught at the moment of transformation between human and animal form. And this amazing image, also from South Africa, really quite a complex image from the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa, thought to be about 8,000 years old. Human bodies, but the heads are those of elands. This eland-headed man has two huge feathers growing out of his back. And this one has got a kind of lumpy structure around his body. And I'm not sure if anybody can see what that is, but if you look closer, you'll notice that that lumpy structure has itself got two heads. There's one, and there's another, antelope heads. And what they are actually is two antelope-headed serpents wrapped around the body of an eland-headed man. And again, the reasonable question to ask is, what was inspiring the artist who created this imagery? It's an incredible privilege to visit the ancient painted caves of southern Europe, these deep, dark, underground cathedrals. To enter into them is immediately to enter into an altered state of consciousness. And although we see what appear to be naturalistic images of animals, when you get closer to some of these images, they're really very strange. This one is no recognizable beast, which suddenly appears on the walls of the cave of Lascaux. And if we go through into this tunnel, we'll find the picture of a deer with these extraordinary antlers, which again are fantastically elaborated against what you see in real life. And also a curious thing, a little geometric pattern underneath the head of the deer. And so we continue on, these beautiful images of horses, but what's this geometry doing here? What is this all about? Archaeologists actually have got really no idea what this is about, although there is a full and thorough explanation which we'll come to. There have been suggestions that they might be gates or fences or something that the ancients were building. Another one, this looks to me like the first example of the cow jumps over the moon, actually. And then here, another of these geometric grids right in front of it. And here, a horse and a bull, and this row of dots just kind of following the line of the horse underneath. What's all that about? Back to South Africa, strange dancing women, headless, with this curious zigzag pattern imposed over the top. And a couple more examples from France. Again, pictures of animals, a bear, a boar that we recognize, but covered with these patterns, here dots, here zigzags. An elephant with a grid superimposed upon it. Needless to say, in everyday life, we do not see grids superimposed on the bodies of elephants. And here from Southern Africa at the top and from Spain at the bottom, these curious patterns. Again, we're looking at art here that in this case is about 8,000 or 9,000 years old, and in this case is close to 30,000 years old. But very similar patterns are being portrayed. Two ibexes with a grid between them. Another of these square patterns with a line of dots running through it from South Africa. From El Castillo Cave in Spain, early example of the Windows logo. It's about 30,000 years old. A flow of dots running down the wall here. Other strange patterns, which for more than a century left archaeologists completely baffled. And here again, these sinuous ladder-like patterns stretching down walls and more Windows logos on the back there. There is a sense when you go into these caves, there's a lot of handprints on the walls. And as you walk through these galleries and see the handprints, first of all, your eye sees them as a handprint, but then something happens. And what you begin to feel is that actually the wall is a membrane between you and another world. And in that other world, somebody is pushing his hand up against the membrane. It's a very strong, intimate feeling of some presence just beyond there. And the same with this is strange image of a face from Altamira Cave in Spain, where they've taken advantage of the natural profile of the rock, and we have the sense of this strange face just pushing through the rock wall from the other side. So we have all of these curious patterns, the atmosphere of the caves, and then these strange therianthropes, these beast men, which appear all over the place. And it's this man, Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, who has really successfully come up with an explanation for what is going on here. An explanation that explains both the therianthropes and the patterns and every other aspect of cave art. And that is that we are dealing with shamanistic art, that this was the work of ancient shamans, and that they had cultivated and deliberately entered altered states of consciousness. And in those altered states of consciousness, they experienced visions, and I will come to the issue of what these visions really might be later on, and that then returning to a normal state of consciousness, they painted their visions on the walls. What really helped this theory, which initially, of course, was massively opposed by the archaeological establishment, but what's helped it become mainstream, because it is now, after 20 years of work on David's part, it is now probably the single most accepted explanation for cave art. What's helped to enlighten this has been work that's been done in our times on altered states of consciousness with human volunteers. Before the insane war on drugs was declared, before that, some research was done with powerful hallucinogens and human volunteers, LSD, DMT, mescaline, and so on, as well as other techniques. And a model was developed of the typical, if you like, although there is really no typical, but the typical altered state of consciousness. And in that state, in the early stage, we tend to see shimmering patterns, often in geometrical form. These begin to take shape. We have a sense of passing through a vortex of some kind into a seamlessly convincing parallel world. And here, on the other side, in that seamlessly convincing parallel world, one of those modern volunteers in the 60s drew what he saw, which was a therianthrope, a man dressed up in a business suit with the head of a fox. And more of these curious patterns, the same patterns that we find on the cave walls, also combined with images of therianthropes. Now, these patterns are called entoptic phenomena, and this chart, I won't go into it in depth, but this is from modern research. This is the rock art of the San. Before Western culture wiped the San out, we were able to talk to some San shamans at the end of the 19th century, and they explained what was happening, that their shamans went into trance, and when they came out of trance, they drew what they saw, and this is what they saw. Same with the Coso in the California Great Basin. And here's the Paleolithic art. Now, we can't go back and interview Paleolithic shamans, but we can see from the nature of the art they produced how similar and connected it is to all of this. It is, in other words, the typical art of deeply altered states of consciousness, coming down in the final stages to encounters with beings who shamans interpret as spirits. And really, it's altered states of consciousness that are fundamental to shamanism. If you encounter a shaman who does not enter an altered state of consciousness in order to perform his duties, I would say that person is not a shaman. That person may be something else, but altered states of consciousness are fundamental to the practice of shamanism and are considered by shamans the only way to gain true and direct contact with the realm of the spirits. And when shamans from all cultures encounter spirits, they're very often encountered in animal form and in partly animal, partly human, in other words, therianthropic form. And that's really the explanation of this. This is two San shamans from South Africa who have gone through to the other side in an altered state of consciousness, transformed into these creatures that are part animal and part human, and gone to grab these serpents, which play a very important part in Bushman mythology in southern Africa. And this extraordinary image from Lascaux in France, well, it looks like a man being gored by a bison, but if you get closer to it, it's a little more complicated than that. Here we see a bird on top of a stick, and that bird is actually an identifiable species of grouse. It's a capercaillie grouse. And curiously, this figure here has got exactly the same head, and this area is called the supraocular comb, which identifies it as a capercaillie grouse. So what we have here is a bird man, also with an erection, very common in shamanistic states and altered states of consciousness. Tilted back at an angle, the body posture is itself relevant. Most likely, this is depicting a shamanic fight. If you talk to shamans in the Amazon today, you'll find that they journey into the other realm and sometimes enter into conflict with other shamans, and sometimes will do so in animal, part human form. And it seems to me that that is the kind of story which underlies this extraordinary 17,000-year-old image. The word shaman, it comes from Tungus Mongol. When the first Western explorers went to Siberia, they encountered people ritual functionaries, who were contacting the spirits, and they were called saman, the one who knows. And we got the English word shaman from that. And then as Western explorers traveled around the world and met other cultures, they found that in many, many other cultures, those same kind of ritual functionaries existed, doing the same thing. So they applied that word to them too, and they all became called shamans. Now, it's interesting that the Tungus shamans used the Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom, as their vehicle for entering altered states of consciousness. Actually, it's quite difficult to get into a deeply altered states of consciousness with the fly agaric. It's very hard work, but they have a system in Siberia that makes it easier, which is that the fly agaric is first of all passed through the system of a reindeer. So the shamans drink the urine of the reindeer that has consumed the fly agaric. And that enters their body stripped of many of the other chemicals which are not helpful for entering an altered state of consciousness in much more pure form. The shaman himself, sorry, it's a bit disgusting, will then urinate in a bowl, and others will come and drink from the shaman's bowl. And it's been found, actually, that you can pass this Amanita muscaria through the human body 7 times before it loses its potency. And it's not an accident that the colors of the Amanita muscaria and Father Christmas are very similar. Because the Tungus shamans also fly around on reindeers in their altered states of consciousness. And indeed, when they come home, they enter through the chimney stack into their hut. So in the innocent Father Christmas mythos, we have a hallucinogenic journey being described. These colors are found everywhere where people use Amanita muscaria. This is from Kamchatka in northern Siberia. Peyote is another visionary plant used by shamans in vision quests. Of course, datura, a very powerful visionary plant, can be dangerous, in fact, if not used properly. Other ways of entering altered states of consciousness, like the sun dance. Those Bushmen in the Kalahari, the San, the people who called themselves the San, were wiped out, but the Kalahari Bushmen nearby maintain many of the same traditions, and they get into an altered state of consciousness not through drugs but through dancing, and they will dance for up to 24 hours around a fire until they sense their spirit leaving their bodies and find themselves in contact with the spirit realm. Those shamans, when they're in that state, they can take, again, this may sound a bit strange to a Western audience, but they can take sweat from under their arm and wipe it on another person. That person will enter an altered state of consciousness almost immediately after this. So 24 hours of dancing around a fire will do it. Now, we all know about magic mushrooms today. But you actually need to go back to 1957. If you go back before 1957, nobody in the modern West knew anything about magic mushrooms. But Gordon Wasson, great researcher, heard stories of a Mexican shaman who was using mushrooms to induce visions. He went down and worked with her, and this was psilocybe cubensis that she was using, and had been used in her culture for centuries, perhaps thousands of years, before that. Since then, we've known about magic mushrooms. Iboga, the plant that enables men to see the dead. I've taken Iboga once. I don't intend to take it again. I felt that I'd been broken on the wheel. I really felt that my body had just been smashed to pieces, torn apart, and eventually, thankfully, reassembled. It was a physically shattering experience, but an emotionally and spiritually important learning experience for me. The use of Iboga originated with the Pygmies, but it's now widely spread throughout Central Africa. The president of Gabon uses Iboga. It's felt a very important part of a human being's development, not to use it regularly or every day. You'd have to be crazy to want to do that. But to use it occasionally as a journey into the truth, which is so often hidden from us by the veils of this world. And ayahuasca from South America, from the Amazon, the most extraordinary vine of the dead. Archaeological remains of ayahuasca paraphernalia have been found going back close to 5,000 years in the Amazon, and it's a safe bet that it's been used in the Amazon for a lot longer than that. We can see that there's more than 70 indigenous cultures in the Amazon that make use of ayahuasca. It's an extremely powerful hallucinogen. It's come into the modern world through the Santo Daime Church, which is a syncretic Brazilian church, and here through the União de Vegetal, UDV, another Brazilian group, another syncretic church, who have members in the United States. Many of you may know this. That in New Mexico, the New Mexico chapter of the UDV, having been raided for possessing an illegal drug, took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor that they have a right to drink ayahuasca because it is an essential element of their religious freedom. Religious freedom. And lastly, tourism. Ayahuasca tourism is becoming very common in the Amazon now. People feel the need to reconnect with spirit. And ayahuasca calls to us from the Amazon. So it's finding its way out. I think of it, it's a vine, and I think of it like tendrils or tentacles just spreading out all around the world and healing and changing the way we think and combating the corrosive and destructive ethic of consumption and endless material progress that we are sold by our society. Ayahuasca contains 2 ingredients, well 3 actually, because one of them is water. But there's this leaf, which is called, the botanical name is Psychotria viridis. It's called chacruna in the Amazon. And the leaf contains substantial quantities of pure dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is a Schedule I drug in this country and indeed throughout the world. However, if you were to consume the leaves on their own, if you were to cook up a tea made with hundreds and hundreds of these leaves, you could cook gallons of it, you could drink them all, and it wouldn't have any effect on you whatsoever. Absolutely none, apart possibly from giving you a stomachache. Because there's an enzyme in our stomachs called monoamine oxidase, which switches off dimethyltryptamine instantly on contact. The other ingredient of the ayahuasca brew is the ayahuasca vine. And the vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor which switches off that enzyme in our stomachs and allows the DMT to be absorbed orally. Now, this is really an extraordinary achievement on the part of the shamans of South America, because there are 155,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon. And it's only by combining 2 that contain these properties that you can get the extraordinary effects of the vine of souls. So it's a mixture of the leaf containing DMT and the vine which switches off the monoamine oxidase in our stomachs. So here's what happens. You smash up the lengths of the vine, you pound them to expose the interior, you lay them down in a cooking pot, then you put a layer of those leaves on top of them, typically around 300 of those leaves. Then you put another layer of the vine, and then you cook for hours and hours and hours until it reduces down to quite a concentrated liquid in the bottom. You pour that off these days into a large plastic bottle, even in the Amazon. And then you add more water to the mixture, and you cook and you pour again, and it takes about 24 hours, and you end up with this. Now, this is a formidable beverage. I would not recommend anybody who's looking for recreational experiences to play with ayahuasca, because ayahuasca is a very serious business. You know it's a serious business the moment that it passes your lips. Actually, talking about it's making me shudder a bit, because it's one of those tastes that's just unforgettably awful. I mean, consider a pile of old socks, some raw sewage, some battery acid, a bit of sulfur, and just a hint of chocolate. That's what the flavor is. So you're not going to drink this for fun. And it enters your system. First 10, 15 minutes, you can, if you wish, walk around and talk. By the time half an hour has passed, you find pretty much you want to either sit still or lie still. And that's what you tend to do. Bring down the lights and just drift. But what's stopping you just drifting as much as you'd really like to do is what's happening to your stomach. Because your stomach is kind of gurgling and rumbling and getting these cramps, which are a bit worrying, especially if you're in the middle of the Amazon jungle, especially if you're British and inhibited, like we are. When you find you've just suddenly got to get up and pull down your pants and get behind that tree as soon as possible. They don't call ayahuasca the purge for no reason. That's one of the names it's known by in the Amazon. It is a most effective purgative, and those purgative effects are actually from the vine, not from the leaves. You're going to vomit as well, probably several times during the night, It's a physical ordeal. But the first thing it taught me was to let go of concerns about my body. That the body is not really the important part of the human being. What's important about us is our consciousness. And what is happening at the level of consciousness with ayahuasca is really quite extraordinary. And this is a painting by my friend Martina Hoffman, one of the great American visionary artists. She lives in Boulder. And what she's depicting there is the correct atmosphere of total surrender to the spirit of ayahuasca, who is an entity, a being, a person, usually, always regarded as female, sometimes appears in the form of a human woman, sometimes appears in the form of a serpent, sometimes appears in the form of a jaguar. All of these manifestations of ayahuasca are represented in Martina's painting. There was one time when I was going through a very low patch in my life, and for some reason I was filled with self-hatred. And I went down to Brazil and had 5 sessions of ayahuasca there. And during one of those sessions, I was visited by the spirit of ayahuasca in the form of a huge serpent. You sensed coming from her love and power. And what went through my mind as she wrapped her coils around my body and rested this huge head on my shoulders and just looked into my eyes what went through my mind was, her business is the planet, but she has time for me. It was extraordinary. I felt an incredible just waves of love coming at me. And what those waves of love were saying was, actually, you can like yourself. You can love yourself. You need to do that, first of all. And I emerged from that healed in extraordinary ways, which have had a huge impact on my life subsequently. The painting here is from Pablo Amaringo, an Amazonian shaman. Unfortunately, he died a few months ago. And he, for those who have not drunk ayahuasca, his imagery is really a very good initiation into what the ayahuasca experience is like. And it very often, whether you drink it in the middle of a city or you drink it in the jungle, you'll find yourself in an enchanted jungle environment, and everything around you is alive and filled with spirit and intelligence. You can move through that environment. As you become more proficient, you can really direct your consciousness where you want it to go. And sometimes you'll come to cities made entirely of crystal that are found in the middle of this environment. What's depicted here is one of the things that happens. Sometimes you get a sense of being taken up into the heavens. You may be on a vehicle of some kind, or in this case on a bird, and carried off into this enchanted other world. Or you may be taken underground, sense of passing deep into the earth. Or you may be taken underwater by therianthropes, by human fish mermaids. In fact, they have a tradition throughout the Amazon that at the bottom of the Amazon River is a city. They call it Encante, enchanted. And all of this comes from ayahuasca experiences, which does not mean to say that the notion of a city is wrong. We need to understand what these experiences are really all about. This sense of enchantment. Here we're looking at the work of Robert Venosa, an American artist, again in Boulder. This sense of everything being alive, and out of these seething patterns of colors, beings seem to push through sometimes and manifest and express themselves to you. Here's Alex Gray, another great visionary artist from New York. And this also was inspired by ayahuasca. And I don't know if you can see, but in this incredible series of patterns and colors, there is the form of a human face pushing through. Everyone who drinks ayahuasca, certainly everyone I've talked to and all the research I've seen, and certainly I myself, see serpents when we drink ayahuasca. It's the most common visionary element of the ayahuasca experience. And just pause to think here a moment about the conventional theory of hallucinations. The conventional theory of hallucinations is that they're entirely idiosyncratic, that our brain on drugs gets scrambled up into a kind of mess, and we stitch together all sorts of elements from our personal biography and our memories and our fantasies, and we stick them all into this hallucination, which is supposed to be utterly meaningless and personal. So how do we explain these transpersonal elements with ayahuasca? Why is it the case that everyone sees serpents under the influence of ayahuasca? Often in incredible form, sometimes transforming into human form. Here, very interestingly, we see another element. The serpents, yes, but down here, more therianthropes, felines with human heads. And that's the other very common element of ayahuasca visions, is therianthropes, just the same kind of beings that we find painted on the cave walls, a bird man and an alligator man here. I had an encounter with an alligator being during an ayahuasca session. I experienced my consciousness as being, I was inside a darkened room, and I could see a door with light coming through it at the far end. I was able to direct myself out of body to float through this room, come out of the door, find myself on a balcony. Ahead of me are golden railings, and beyond that is a body of water. I'm not quite sure what it was, a river or a lake or the ocean. And to my right is a statue carved entirely out of green jade with the head of an alligator or a crocodile. So I look at the statue, I think fine, and then its eyes turn towards me. And I didn't think fine anymore. I thought afraid. And it's not the first time that's happened, where I've stopped an ayahuasca vision by opening my eyes. And every time I do that, I really regret it. Benny Shannon is the professor of psychology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's done a fantastic study on ayahuasca, the antipodes of the mind, and he's documented just stunning correspondences of experiences amongst people who didn't know each other, never compared notes, hadn't read the same literature, but nevertheless they're having the same supposedly unreal experiences. And these experiences aren't just common in modern times, they seem to go back into the ancient world. Here from South Africa, a human being wrapped in the coils of a serpent, and here again the same idea in one of Pablo Amaringo's paintings from the Amazon. Here from Peshmerl Cave in France, this dotted horse, and again, this very similar idea with this bull here. And yeah, I'm not saying they were drinking ayahuasca in the caves. They certainly weren't. Those plants are not available in Europe. But the research I've done suggests that they were using a psilocybin mushroom, and that it was Psilocybe semilanciata, the liberty cap, that they were using. And here's the weird thing. That strange animal from Lascaux, well, a Jivaro shaman in eastern Ecuador in 1958, under the influence of ayahuasca, saw something almost identical to it. There's a sense of, first and foremost, connection with our planet and with sentient, intelligent nature throughout our planet. But secondly, with ayahuasca, a sense of a connection to the beyond, to the distant, to the universe, to everything that is. And curiously, when you get closer into Pablo's paintings, well, there's that crocodile man. But over here, there's a flying saucer in the painting from, 1986. Why is Pablo painting a flying saucer? Well, he's painting it because he saw it in his visions. And that bird man that I showed you, up above him, more flying saucers. And more. It goes on and on and on. It's a constant theme. And so this leads me to ask, what are UFOs and aliens and ET abductions? Because many of the experiences that shamans report in altered states of consciousness with spirits are really quite eerily identical to the experiences that are reported by people who believe they've been abducted by UFOs in the modern world. I had one alien-type experience under ayahuasca. As you can see, I am not an artist. But I did my best. And again, it was one of those occasions when I opened my eyes and said no, and I stopped the vision, stopped it in its tracks, because I was afraid, because I was convinced there was these ships in the sky and a funnel of light, and I was convinced that I was going to be drawn up, and I didn't want to go. And my cowardice got the better of my courage, and I said no, and afterwards regretted it. We know a lot about UFO abduction experiences from the work of a number of researchers, David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, and the late Dr. John Mack, who was professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, who recorded... people started coming to him in his practice, very troubled people, they'd had very disturbing experiences, and they believed that they'd been abducted by aliens. And unlike most psychiatrists who just dismiss this as madness, John Mack took it seriously and didn't judge. He wanted to document their experiences. And so from his work, we have a vast documentation of a very thorough scientific documentation of the experiences of UFO abductees. Of course, John Mack was completely ostracized by the Harvard academic community for even listening to this material, and only was able to... he had tenure, of course, but he was only able to hold on to his job with a lawsuit. And just before he died, he told me that he had been officially excommunicated by science, that they just wouldn't speak to him. They'd pass him in the corridor and actually not even look at him. He wasn't real anymore because he'd gone into this dangerous area of inquiry. Well, there are astonishing similarities between the spirits encountered by shamans and the beings that we think of today as aliens, and I've given some examples here. It's very common with shamans, as I've said before, that the spirits appear as animals, birds, fish, or as beastmen, as therianthropes. And it's exactly the same with UFO abductees. Here's one who, before the creature turned into a more typical grey, she experienced it as an intelligent grey deer. Another one saw a deer looking through her window just before she was abducted. Another one had a wolf standing on her bed. And John Mack summarizes it here, that the aliens are shapeshifters and that they often appear as owls, eagles, raccoons, deer, and so on, that the abductees see initially. Shamans being floated up to the sky on threads of light, or sometimes just lifted into the sky. And we have some drawings of this, rock paintings of this kind of experience from southern Africa. And again, the parallels with UFO abductees are really quite stunning, where we see Andrea seeing a line of thread or light going up it. Another one sees a light like a thread, very similar to the descriptions given by the Bushman shamans in southern Africa. Being taken underwater or into caves or underground locations, very common with shamans. Give an example at the bottom here from Australia, where the shaman experiences himself carried into a very deep cave and attended to by beings. Again, UFO abductees have reported very similar experiences of being taken on board a UFO, plunged into the sea, taken into a rock, through a tunnel beneath the sea, finds himself inside a cave lined with stalactites and stalagmites. There's something strange in there. Very, very similar experiences here. The shamanic ordeal, this is one of the defining experiences of the shaman, where you're taken out of your body and you experience yourself being cut to pieces, disassembled, broken apart, as I described earlier with Ibogaine. Very commonly, shamans speak of their bodies being pierced or cut, and talk of bizarre surgical procedures in which stones and rock crystals and other objects are put inside their bodies, sometimes into their brains. And of course, this is very similar to the notions that we have with UFO abductees, who are talking again about strange surgery being conducted on them, about implants being put inside their bodies. I find this one particularly telling. A Yakut shaman cited by Mircea Eliade, the spirits cut off his head, which they set aside, and here Sandra Larson, beings removed her brain and set it down beside her. And this one, the counting of bones, that's reported by shamans and by UFO abductees. Now, either all of this is an incredible coincidence, or there's something going on which unites these two apparently very different domains of experience. Sex with spirits, very common amongst shamans. I know an Amazonian shaman whose wife in this world has actually left him because of his wife in the other world. It's that bad. He's got kids over there too. And again, very similar with UFO abductees who have sex with aliens, are abducted repeatedly to care for their hybrid offspring, part alien, part human. Shamans often report being given books. They may be illiterate, but when they're given a book, they can suddenly read it. Maria Sabina was given a book. She's that Mexican shaman who used the Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. She wasn't allowed to bring the book back, but she learned many things from it. Likewise with Betty Hill. She was given a book, and similarly Betty Andreasson. And in many cases, these are people, both shamans and UFO abductees, who return with a sense of mission and perhaps even healing powers. So shamans and aliens, I've drawn some of the many comparisons between them. But what about fairies and elves? This is another strange area of human experience. And why do they also have so much in common with aliens and spirits? Now, I want to pay tribute to the incredibly important work of Jacques Vallée in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia. And Jacques Vallée documented for the first time the very curious crossovers between the entities that we construe as aliens and the entities that people in medieval Europe construed as fairies and elves. And what I've done in my work is to just take that body of work on from 1969 and bring it right through into the 21st century, where we have greatly more testimony available. If you go back to the Middle Ages, you'll find that fairies were renowned for abducting people, that they were sometimes cruel and tortured people, but they also sometimes gave people gifts, including healing powers, that they could fly, that they had aerial vehicles. All this is very common in fairy lore. And when fairies abducted you, they would quite often take you underground or into a cave. And it's interesting, in both of these medieval illustrations, here we see the fairies dancing in a ring, and then there's a doorway into the hollow hills beyond, and in the foreground, an Amanita muscaria mushroom. And here, this young man is being seduced into the fairy underworld by beautiful fairy damsels, and down there looks suspiciously like a clump of mushrooms to me. Fairies and elves also appear as human-animal hybrids. I keep this illustration on my desk. It's from the 15th century in Holland. It shows a group of fairies dancing in a circle, and as you can see, they are therianthropes, part animal and part human in form. I mentioned Melusine earlier, a very feared medieval fairy who took the form of a serpent woman. She was feared because she abducted human babies and substituted what were called changelings in their place. There are many reports of human women being abducted to nurse fairy babes. And we have exactly the same kind of reports from UFO abductees today. So we human beings, we cannot see something without interpreting it. There is no such thing as just objective vision. We interpret it according to where we're coming from and who we are and our life experiences. And what I'm suggesting is that these three supposedly different domains, fairies and elves, aliens and spirits, are actually all one domain viewed through different cultural spectacles. We're applying our particular cultural framework to it when we think it's aliens who are crossing space in spaceships because we're a culture that's invented spaceships. And we despise fairies, but we're prepared to consider aliens. So here's some of the common forms in which aliens and spirits and fairies all appear. And I think it's obvious that the therianthropic aspect in particular, but others too, have been with us now for more than 40,000 years. And there are some strange humanoid faces in the caves too, like this one. I would say that that's the nose area. It's a high domed forehead, narrow pointed chin. This extraordinary and mysterious figure from Pechmerle in France, 24,000 years old, pierced, rather like those shamanic ordeal figures that I showed you. Strange-looking head, and up above it in the sky, some odd object which nobody's ever been able to understand what it is. We've done a redrawing of that head, and this is what it looks like. High-domed forehead, narrow-pointed chin, dark eyes, 24,000 years old. Another very similar figure from South Africa, from the Drakensberg, again, that same profile of the head. I don't think it's a great leap to suggest that since we see the other forms in which we recognize aliens today depicted on the walls of the caves, I think this is a good bet that that's what we're looking at here as well. I'm not saying they're aliens, I'm saying that they're in the same experience inspired these images. And there are other odd things on the cave walls too. There's Pablo's painting of a flying saucer from 1986, and here from about 20,000 years ago in Spain, this very strange object, and here also. I mean, if we were to see this flying through the skies over our head today, we'd definitely say UFO. Archaeologists don't know what it is. 3 of these 4 patterns are found on the walls of painted caves in Europe dating back about 20,000 years, and the artists did them by actually with their fingers running these patterns into the soft material on the cave ceiling, and they're still there. But one of them was done by a modern UFO abductee, one of John Mack's patients in 1990. And she said that every time the aliens came to abduct her, just before they abducted her, they projected this image into her visual field. This is the modern image, and the others are the Stone Age images. But I'm suggesting that the same inspiration lies behind both, and I don't actually take an immediate nuts and bolts explanation for this. The nuts and bolts explanation would be that physical beings like us have conquered interstellar space and have been interacting with us for the last 40,000 years, leaving some documentation on the cave walls. I'm not totally ruling that out, but I'm just saying that I think the experience is actually rather more mysterious and interesting than that, and may have more to do with dimensions than physical space. Because there's really good evidence that such experiences do become accessible to us through alterations in our state of consciousness, as much as through any physical contacts. And here I want to refer you to the work of my friend Dr. Rick Strassman, who's professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, and who got the first permission from the US federal government for more than 20 years to conduct research with human volunteers on a powerful hallucinogen. And he used DMT. And DMT, given to his volunteers, produced really extraordinary results. They recorded their experiences. I won't read all of these out, but elves and alien-type experiences were again and again reported by these people who were given DMT on a hospital bed in the University of New Mexico. DMT, as I said, cannot be absorbed orally without a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, but it can be injected, and it works. And that's what Rick Strassman was giving his volunteers. By the way, it's completely non-addictive. I'm not aware of any addictive hallucinogen. More examples from Rick's volunteers. Insect creatures all around them. Again, one of my alien-type encounters under ayahuasca had these segmented insect-type eyes. Or being in an alien laboratory of creatures that probed one of the volunteers in some strange way. And this sense of just blasting through into another realm and encountering beings there who expecting you to arrive. I mean, one of the very strange examples is where one of these volunteers, under the influence of DMT, meets a being who basically says, "I'm so glad that you've discovered this technology. Now we can communicate more often." A number of volunteers reported that similar experience. Now, is this personal inner space? Or is something else going on here because of the transpersonal element of this, experiences that are shared by many, many, many people? And Rick Strassman, eventually, he actually had to give up his research because it was so mind-blowing in the results that his volunteers were meeting the same beings in the same realm. How could that be explained within the modern Western framework of understanding reality? Could it be that they were all getting this UFO imagery from our culture? Maybe they read the National Enquirer or watched, whatever. Could it be that? Well, no, because there's a work done with DMT and human volunteers in the 1950s. Now, that's important because not a single abduction case was reported before 1961. Not one. There were many UFO sightings, but no abduction case. But these DMT volunteers in the 1950s were reporting experiences that are very similar to those being reported by modern UFO abductees. So it's more like the culture is getting the imagery from these visionary experiences rather than that the culture is feeding into the imagery. Furthermore, Strassman's volunteers definitely were not being abducted by physical aliens because they were lying there on a hospital bed in front of Rick Strassman. So does that mean that this was just brain candy, that these experiences were just meaningless hallucinations? And if they were, then how come all of the volunteers were reporting the same experiences? And this leads us to ask, what actually is reality? What is it? And Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, I think makes a very important point where he says that it's actually a product of two things: the exterior world, the sender, and the receiver, us, ourselves. These two things together with our antennae, our ability to sense reality around us, are essential. But maybe there is more to the exterior world than our senses can receive. William Blake talked about this with his notion of the doors of perception, that somehow we see through a glass darkly, and that if only we could clear our doors of perception, we could see everything as it truly is, which, as he said, is infinite. William James, the brother of the novelist Henry James, was a great psychiatrist at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and he experimented with nitrous oxide. And it's very interesting because what I've outlined in green here, I think he was so moved by this experience that he said that really we can't have a total account of the universe if we leave these experiences out of the picture. They certainly forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. And I believe that is what Western science has done. It has prematurely closed our accounts with reality because Western science is fundamentally highly materialistic. It is concerned with things that can be weighed, measured, and counted. And it dismisses such notions as the soul and as spirits and as other realms. And another point that James makes, look, we're physical creatures. If there is a spiritual element to us, it has to have a physical interface. And maybe we need to be in a different state of consciousness in order to register these experiences. Aldous Huxley, similar arguments that the brain is a reducing valve. It fundamentally functions to cut experiences out, to narrow down reality. Otherwise, we just all go crazy with everything that's pouring in on us. But every now and then, we get a temporary bypass to the reducing valve. Aldous Huxley called the visionary plants gratuitous graces, which give us the opportunity to bypass that reducing valve and see much more than we normally do. Back to Hoffman again, very important model, that we need to start thinking of the brain not as a generator of consciousness, but as a receiver of consciousness. If it's a receiver, then its receiver wavelength can be changed and possibly pick up other levels of reality not normally accessible to us. And Rick Strassman echoes that point, that yes, there is a change in brain function induced by a chemical, and that perhaps what this is doing is allowing us to perceive and allowing others to perceive freestanding parallel planes of reality that we can't normally see with our normal senses. And Rick talks about how most of us, most of the time, are tuned into channel normal, but that there are a lot of other channels broadcasting as well, and if we would like to tune into those channels and learn from them, then we are going to need to alter our state of consciousness. Now, actually, there's nothing in science. Many scientists will tell you that hallucinations are just rubbish, but there's nothing in science that allows them to say that hallucinations are just artifacts of the brain. And the analogy that I like to use to bring this across is the analogy of the telescope. You see, a scientist will wire up somebody in a visionary state, horrible thought, to an MRI scanner and see certain parts of the brain lighting up. And the scientist will then say, because the scientist is not seeing the visions that that person is seeing, the scientist will then say, oh, those visions are just that brain activity. That's all it is. It's just purely an artifact of brain activity. There's no reality to it. Well, let's take the analogy of a telescope. You want to look at a very distant star with your little home telescope. You're going to have to adjust the focus of the telescope. As you do so, physical changes will take place inside the barrel of the telescope between the lenses that are in there. And eventually, the star will come into view. You'd be completely wrong to say that the star is the physical changes inside the barrel of the telescope. Those physical changes were necessary to allow you to see the star, but the star is real. And that's the suggestion with altered states of consciousness and the nature of reality. Do we have a secret doorway inside our minds through which intelligences in other dimensions can make contact with us? And if we did, what sort of evidence would we look for of that? Well, here's a horrible picture of the human family tree. Going back to the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee, about 6 million years ago, the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee. We didn't have any stone tools at all until about 2.5 million years ago. Then we started creating these very simple stone tools, and having created them, we then stuck with them absolutely rigidly, without any change whatsoever, for about 1 million years. We just kept on reproducing the same pattern again and again and again. Then there was a slight change, the Acheulean, and then another 1 million years of fixity without any change. So what does this tell us? It does tell us that ideas are being handed down from generation to generation. It also tells us that we have a tendency to be very rigid and inflexible creatures who can't shift in a new direction once we get set on a particular track. Human family tree, again, those 6 million years, I think of them as 6 million years of total boredom. It's just awful. I mean, our ancestors, honestly, they're so dull. Millions and millions and millions of years of repetitive, dull, robotic behavior. It goes on and on and on and on and on. You get fully anatomically modern humans about 195,000 years ago, but their behavior doesn't change. It carries on being this dull, repetitive mimicry. No spirituality, no creativity, no symbolism. We are just boring. And then, after 40,000 years ago, whoomph, it's like a light is switched on in the human brain all around the world. Something extraordinary has happened. We start making this incredible art, complicated, symbolic, disturbing art. And at the same time, we do all kinds of other things that we haven't done before. We start burying our dead with grave goods. That means we believe then that some essence of the individual survives death and continues on after death. Otherwise, why bury that individual with water and food? Our hunting techniques get better. The whole game of the human race is rapidly advanced, and we're set on the road to the modern world. I mean, this is a wonderful image from Peshmerl, framed by stalactites of these spotted horses. And all around these images, what do we find? These images of therianthropes, which we know shamans see today and regard as their teachers, which we know UFO abductees see and regard themselves as also having teaching and learning experiences. Could it be that that great human leap forward 40 to 30,000 years ago was not the result of the state of consciousness that scientists and modern government like, the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness suitable for physical existence in the modern world. It appears that actually that huge leap forward resulted from the cultivation of altered states of consciousness, the evidence for which is painted on the cave walls. That's when we started to think symbolically. It's like we received a huge teaching, and it changed our direction dramatically. And we're not the only people who've received teachings in altered states of consciousness. Francis Crick never let this out while he was alive, but he confided in it to friends that he first saw the double helix form of DNA while he was under the influence of LSD. And these guys, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who've undoubtedly had a massive effect on the modern world, are quite open in pointing out that their inspiration also came from LSD, and that it was a fundamental and important element in the work that they did. So it seems that we're not dealing, by any measure, with simple brain candy here. Rather, we're dealing with experiences that are transformative. And what those experiences are the opposite of, really, and require us to break away from, are the utter ruthless dominance of the alert problem-solving state of consciousness in our society today, from which we are, that is the state of consciousness that we need for finance, for war, for science, for all kinds of activities, both good and bad. And we're allowed to escape from it with reality TV and booze. These are the ways. These are two options. We can either be alert problem solvers, or we can be blitzed out boozers if we want to get away from that, or just sit on the couch and watch really hideous television 24 hours a day. What is this doing to our state of consciousness? You have to ask yourself, the exposure to this stuff, day in, day out. The hubbub of waking life, as William James said, might be cutting us off from higher realms that want to make contact with us. And I feel that what's at stake in this is really huge. And I think a struggle is underway in our society. I think we stand at a crossroads today. It is by no means certain that the human race and human civilization as we know it is going to continue for very much longer. Or it can. But it's up to us to make the right choices right now. And fundamental to this is consciousness. The more I look at this whole situation of the way that hallucinogens are treated in our society, the more I see it as a sign for a deep fundamental malaise in our society. And it may be the case that by demonizing altered states of consciousness, we are actually denying ourselves the next step forward in our evolution as a species, just as happened 40,000 years ago to our ancestors in those caves. What is it? Why does any government have the right to tell an adult what they may or may not experience inside their own heads? So many of us unthinkingly buy into the fundamental philosophy behind the war on drugs. And the fundamental philosophy behind the war on drugs is that actually the state has a complete right not only to enter your home, but also to enter your head and to tell you what you may and may not experience there. How can we possibly talk about living in a free society when we are not even sovereign over our own consciousness? If we're not sovereign over our own consciousness, quite frankly, we're not sovereign over anything. Everything is just a nonsense. To talk about liberty and democracy and freedom and to seek that impose our form of liberty on other countries around the world, while we actually will send people to prison for tens of years for exploring their own consciousness through the use of ancient and sacred plants, this is a terrible problem. There's something terribly wrong here. We have to re-establish contact with spirit. When I spoke to shamans in the Amazon about the West and the West's role in also what is happening in the Amazon, they see a profound sickness in Western society, and they analyze that sickness very simply, that Western society has severed its connection with spirit. And I believe that these ancient and sacred plants, amongst other techniques, our opportunity to reconnect with spirit. We really are poised on the edge of the abyss. And right now we have a choice. The message is there. It's up to us what we choose. You know, we can choose to have more of this, or we can choose the enchanted jungle. But we can't have both. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.